Hi, welcome. Hi, Ethan. Good to see you again.
See you too. How are you?
Good. Your camera is upside down, Ethan. There we go. All right, we're going to give people maybe 2 more minutes and then I'll go ahead and get started just in case anybody's running late. Well, actually, I think to give us more time, I can go ahead and get started. I'm going to play a really cool screen slideshow while I wait. We wait. Give me a second. All right, can you all see the cool slideshow?
Yep.
Cool, okay. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and get started and people will keep arriving. Good evening and welcome to the second edition of the NCMA Film Club featuring Style Wars. We encourage you to participate in the chat by letting us know where you're joining from. My name is Maria Lopez and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs at the North Carolina Museum of Art. I really hope you all enjoyed watching the movies and I'm really looking forward to talking about them with you and our special guests, of course. Before I introduce our special guest today, I'd like to give an overview of our program and go over a few tips and guidelines to make our time together more enjoyable. We encourage you to use a speaker view as opposed to gallery view during the discussion, so this way you can see who's actually speaking at the moment. Please try to keep your microphone muted at all times unless you're actively making a comment or asking a question. If you have a comment or question, you can let us know by using the raise hand function on Zoom, physically raising your hand, or by stating you have a comment or question in the chat, and then we'll call on you and you can go ahead and speak. To use the raise the hand, lower hand function, you just click on the participants on the bottom of your screen and click on the little icon. We do ask you to make sure your Zoom screen name includes your first name and last initial or last name, just so it's more personal. You're welcome to participate as much as little as you like. It is fine if you prefer to have your video and audio turned off throughout and choose to just listen and contribute to the chat. Please be considerate of your fellow participants and let everyone have space to share their voice. And we will try to keep this conversation to 1 hour, but if we do go over by a few minutes, please know that you're free to leave when you want. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two very special guests for this discussion tonight, Jedidiah Gant and Napoleon Wright II. Jedidiah Gant is a designer living with his wife, 2 kids, and pup in downtown Raleigh, where he's walked the streets looking for creative opportunities and vinyl records since 2005. By day, he works as brand director at the video agency Myriad, and by night, he helps find walls for colorful murals with the Raleigh Murals Project. Former projects include hyperlocal obsessive news brand New Raleigh, neighborhood-focused Cook Street Carnival, and urban art fund Flight Raleigh. Our second guest is Napoleon Wright II. He's a motion designer, graphic designer, illustrator, and video and music producer. He began his design career working in public relations and corporate environments. He now uses that background within his own company, Pan2 Creative. His passion is to support agencies, groups, and individuals with their creative needs. To further this mission, he also founded a branch of Pan2 Creative called Because Us to serve as his outlet for the greater good. To inform his creative process, Wright draws upon foundational experiences as a military brat who grew up around the country as well as overseas. He departed from the nomadic life upon moving to North Carolina in 2000 and has been establishing roots in Raleigh over the past 13 years. When he's not in front of the screen, you can find him dancing with his b-boy crew, the Raleigh Rockers, or playing basketball at the YMCA. Welcome, Jed and Napoleon. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Great.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, I think we might have some latecomers, but we'll go ahead and get started. And to kick us off, Jed and Napoleon, can you tell us about your experience with the film? Had you seen it before? Was this your first time? And if you saw it before, what did you initially think of the film?
I'll go first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had seen it before. I saw it a while ago, actually. Probably 2005, 2006, or something like that. But yeah, the first time I saw it, it just felt like my heart and soul, I guess you could say, when I just saw how authentic it was, and how it was just a real story that I could relate to. And so it was refreshing to just sit down and watch it again. And I just love the authenticity of the film and not the characters, but the people that were in it. They were definitely representative of that time, from the crews that were the hot crews at the time, Rocksteady crew, Dynamic Rockers, and some of the artists themselves. So yeah, I mean, I felt the same thing then that I felt when I rewatched it again. So
I think, did we watch it together, Napoleon? Because I think I saw it at the exact same time, 2005, for the first time. I think that was about the same time I watched it for the first time. It was actually after I moved to Raleigh, when I moved there about 2005. And I think that for me, at the time, it's not that street art was new to me, but it was something that was it was actually foreign to me, because I grew up in a really small town in North Carolina, and street art was not a thing. And so it was a little, not revolutionary, but, kind of eye-opening to me, to see back in the time capsule of the 80s and how New York was and how this style came about, because I think I was getting into late 90s, early 2000s, I was getting more into street art. And so I think it was recommended to me by Sean Koenig, who's a muralist, writer, graffiti artist around here. I think he's actually the one who recommended it to me when I met him here. And yeah, I think so. So to me, it was kind of an introduction to that scene that I didn't know much about at the time, but I knew a little bit of those type of artists. And so seeing it again, I don't know, 15 years later, I've been a little more embedded in at least the local Raleigh scene of street art and murals, and even meeting Napoleon years ago, and having him at the carnival, and getting more ingrained in the kind of local scene, and having the rockers and the b-boy. I think in between my two viewings, I was able to kind of get more knowledge about that scene. And so it's cool to see it again now in retrospect, knowing more about the scene and saying, oh, okay, this is where it all came from. And even like my son took some dance lessons with Brandon and the whole rocker crew. And so to start to see where those moves were, in retrospect through my son's mind, and now seeing it again, it was just kind of it's like a flashback, but now I know more about it. And it was just cool to kind of recollect back on that time.
Great. Did rewatching it change any of your your perspectives on the movie? Or
I think for me, it was just kind of a reminder of how history repeats itself in different kinds of ways. I think that similar things, first and foremost, just being an artist and a creative in general, you run into very similar issues that they ran into then, of self-expression, how you can do it, how you're supposed to do it, where you can do it, things like that. And just kind of the environment of not a lot of resources being in certain communities, which then we kind of come together to create our own worlds, essentially, that then blossom into beautiful things, whether they're music or art, and I think that it just kind of reminded me when I watched it again of just how just transcendent I think the documentary is, just because I think when you watch it, there's just so many angles that you can watch it from, because in the documentary, like they cover, you know, just so I can say this, like when I watched it again, you really do see how they were tapped into what, like who the top, you know, dancers were at the time, who the top graffiti artists were at the time. You know, they didn't just go up to a random person and say like, hey, we want to make a documentary on you and you have a can in your hand, so let us film you. You know, they were actually filming like legends in the world of graffiti and legends in the world of dance. So like, you know, they were there. And I think that, you know, just watching it again, it just reminded me of how just as an artist and as a creative, you know, whether you're someone who wants to create with the means that you have, and essentially by any means necessary, or someone who is just trying to get your name heard in general, as an artist and creator, which I think you always are trying to do in some fashion, you know, just trying to create because you feel the need to do it, but also, you know, it's like you would love to be able to just do you for a living, you know, like that's the dream, is to just create and do that for a living. So, you know, it just kind of reminded me of how like I'm looking at these young kids on this documentary who now grew up to either be legends or, you know, are always going to go down in history as being in Star Wars. So, you know, they didn't know it then, but it's just cool to see like they stuck with it and it actually paid off, because we're talking about them right now. So
Yeah, I'll jump on your earlier comment, Napoleon, about history repeat itself. I think that that is something that hit me while watching it this time, is, you know, the idea that, you know, many of these writers at the time were either young or, you know, Black. I think that there was a lot of kind of, it was like the government versus like the street kids, or, you know, the artist, right? And I think that at the time that was kind of like, as the documentary kind of shows, maybe it was a small community, but now, you know, almost 40 years later, with everything that's happened this year, I think that there was that, like, it's just a reminder that those issues are kind of systemic and that they're still here, just in a different fashion. Um, and it's interesting because when you watch something when you're younger and then you watch it again, like I think part of what you're asking, Marie, is like, you know, it changes. I mean, this is a little of a tangent, but I've been watching The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air with my kids again, and they love it because it's fun and silly and just kind of cool. The music, you know, it's just great. But last night we actually watched the 5th or 6th episode in the first season, and it's about them getting stopped and pulled over by cops. And, you know, and so for my brain, I'm like, wow, like as a kid, that didn't make an impact on me when I watched it as much as it did now. And I think that this film kind of has a similar kind of mindset, because some of the things that I wrote down was like, the guys like walking out and like, there's nothing like a nice white shiny car pulling up at the station when they want to kind of whitewash these things. And I think that was something. And then like, I think that they were talking all about like holding back the enemies from destroying our trains with this barbed wire and all of these things. So that really kind of made me think, but also in a way that like, but I think things have changed a lot in society, in that this year when we had the protest, right, the answer was murals and street artists. Like, not the answer, that's not the right statement. The I don't know what the right word is. What happened after that was an outpouring of giving artists a surface to express themselves, especially Black and brown artists that had been kind of systematic racism for years. And so that was the opposite of what this film shows, which is the artist being there and then the government or people fighting against doing that in cities, right? And then the final thing I'll just mention about what kind of hit me is like the music. I think that, and seeing all these things kind of intertwined is something that kind of hit me too, is like seeing that hip hop and breakdancing and graffiti was all one scene. I don't think I don't know any other kind of situation like the 60s when like drugs and rock and roll and whatever were a scene, right? I think there's something about that and how hip hop was so ingrained in that it just kind of hit me like, oh, that was really cool. That was a scene that we haven't seen much of since. You know, these kind of three art forms with a variety of expressions of a singular kind of mindset and community, which I thought was really cool.
Great, thank you, Jed.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody want to share their, their opinions, thoughts on the film, and share their experience? If this is the first time you watched it, if this was a rewatch, don't be shy.
I really liked it. I had never seen it before. I mean, it sounded familiar, but then I also thought it was like about 80s fashion. You know, it sort of had that vibe. And I was glad to see the breakdance and stuff. That was kind of cool to see too, because like Jed said, it was all one thing. But I also like this. I also like that there were different races. In the groups. They were all friends. I mean, there was vernacular that obviously we don't use today, but that there was no malice towards it. That's just how people talked back then, and New Yorkers and stuff like that. But I thought it was cool because there was one kid who's like, well, I grew up on the Upper West Side. I went to like private school, but this is just what I love to do. And then the guy, I guess the bad guy, what was the guy? The
Cap.
Yeah, he was just seen like this, good old boy. I just want to destroy everything. But yeah, it was pretty cool. Everyone was sort of, that was the thing. There was nothing else but the bombing. Which I really liked.
Great, thank you, Terrence. Does anybody want to share? All right. Well, we can move on to the nitty gritty, the discussion questions.
Can I first come in before we do that, Maria?
Sure.
I think something I was just thinking about as you said that too was like, if anyone's here that hasn't, we were talking a little bit about fictionalized versus non-fictionalized versions of this kind of stuff, or this era, right? So if anyone wants to see more like a fictionalized version of this era, I think the Get Down on Netflix is a really interesting kind of representation of it. And Netflix has several shows like Rapture and even Hip Hop Evolution that talks a lot about like Bambaataa and Kool Herc and all of that era, and how the music became, and how Napoleon could talk to this much better than I can, but how like hip hop and the breaks in like James Brown songs and even jazz became kind of created into, repeated by DJs like DJ Kool Herc and Bambaataa, and repeated and turned into what was called break dancing, because the dancers would then dance on those breaks. And so there's something about that I think it's not like represented in this film, but it's kind of like because it's not about that really. That's kind of in the scene. It's more about them as personalities. And so I just encourage you, if you really like this and this topic, there's a lot of great resources that dig into the history of it in a very descriptive and informative way that I've watched, and I actually love watching it because it's so detailed and gives the perspective from so many different people's views. So yeah,
thank you, Jed. And what I'll also try to do is I'll try to send some of these shows that Jed is mentioning in an follow-up email to you all, so you can check them out. So I guess the first big question that I want to pose to Jed and Napoleon, and the way I'm going to do this, I'll pose the question to them first, and then I'll open it up to you all to discuss it. So what do you think is, why do you think the young artists in this documentary are so drawn to the graffiti and hip hop culture? And what is it that you think they're trying to say about their lives or society through both graffiti and hip hop?
I'll go ahead and go first. I think one of the main things is a sense of freedom that you have within graffiti and within hip hop. The ability to express yourself. You know what I mean? Like one of the biggest thing in the graffiti culture and in the hip hop culture and in the breaking culture is style and self-expression. The worst thing that you can do ever is to what they call biting, which is steal someone else's style and claim it for your own and say that you did it and like it's your thing. So I think the reason you're attracted to it is just the sense of freedom that you have. You know, you go to school, you're told what to do, your parents tell you what to do, the city you're living in are telling you what to do, and they're definitely don't think that you can do any good. And so you have this thing that's a culture that has started where you're accepted and you're welcome just for your individuality. And you know, as someone was saying earlier, you know, the hip hop culture, one of the main reasons that I just was organically attracted to it. I love all types of music, but when I noticed that in the hip hop culture, I saw people that look like me and I saw people that didn't look like me, but inside and in their soul, we all look the same. And I think that's what you saw, or I think that is an element of why hip hop is a global thing. Graffiti culture is a global thing. And I think why these young people were attracted to it was because it wasn't about what you looked like, what you sounded like, where you were from. You know, it was, you had a connection, and that connection was either the music or the connection was the art or graffiti. And if you got it and you understood it, then you understood it. You know, it wasn't something that you had to explain to other people. And that was kind of the beauty in it, where it was just like this unspoken thing, you know what I mean? Like even today, like if I go to, well, not now because of COVID, but you know, before at battles, I'll go to a battle and I might not know a person, but then they'll dance in the cypher, and then immediately I generally know something about them, like the way that they hear the music. If are they smooth with it, are they aggressive, like, you know, kind of. And then, you know, how I go in after them, the proximity of which I'm dancing to them, you know, if I'm aggressive with them, you know, that's not really my style. But you know, all I'm saying is like there's a hidden conversation and a hidden culture that I think as a young person that you, at that time, especially being able to claim something of your own when you're living in a city that is like, you know, full of drugs and you know, people getting robbed and mugged, you know, it was a intense time in the city, you know what I mean? And I think for them to find this kind of camaraderie and community within each other, that didn't judge them, I think that was one of the main reasons that they may have been attracted to that.
Jed, do you have anything to add?
I don't think I can say it any better than how Napoleon just said it, really, except I will add, like, I totally agree. I was going to say that about battles, that hip hop is about battles, and breakdancing is about battles, and you know, to a certain degree, graffiti is about battles, right? And so there's all of that. It's competition, but like friendly competition. I mean, it can get negative at a time, and so there is that connection across each one of these genres. But one thing I was going to say was, I think it was a quote that I wrote down from the film, which is one of the guys said, like, we're bombing the system, right? And I think that there is a connection between, you know, graffiti and even some in breakdancing, but a lot in hip hop about bombing the system, right? And I mean, if you think about even like the Public Enemy and, you know, artists like that are coming out of the scene, that it's about, like Napoleon saying, self-expression and originality, but also testing and disrupting the status quo. And I think that that is what graffiti is about. I think that is what hip hop is about at its core, is, you know, saying, and also like being treated in a way that is like inhumane. And so saying through self-expression, this is who we are as a community, to me is very important in both of those art forms. And that's why there's a connection between them, because they have a similar kind of core concept, which is this idea of like questioning the status quo in the system.
And if I could just say something real quick based off of what you were saying, Jed, like, I think that's one of the reasons why hip hop is such a universal culture, and music itself, is because I feel that people of all races and all backgrounds all over the world can identify with the foundational element of what hip hop is, which is bombing the system. You know what I mean? You know, people who might not have been able to, where in whatever fashion or whatever situation that they're in, where they're like, I can't really be my true self. You know, I have to be a certain kind of thing in a certain kind of environment. I think that type of mentality crosses all cultures and backgrounds and races, which is why I think hip hop is such a universal form of music at its core, culturally. But yeah, just to build off of what you were saying, it just reminded me of that, of, you know, everybody, I feel like everybody can relate to that, and that's why it's a global thing.
It's like 8 Mile. It just brings to mind 8 Mile and what some of the core of 8 Mile, the film, was about, right? And Eminem's kind of attempt to bring the battles and kind of create this community around that. And I think that, I don't know why that came up in my head, but it just kind of, like you said, it's kind of, that just reminds me of kind of what Terrence was saying too, this universality of like different races and creeds and situations kind of coming together, and kind of bonding in some way over hip hop, over breakdancing, whatever it may be.
Great, thank you. Does anybody want to add to that? Why do you think the young artists in this documentary are so drawn to the graffiti and hip hop culture? Or any ideas of what you think they're trying to say through graffiti and hip hop? Okay, well, if that's fine. You know, we have plenty of other questions, so we'll move on. And this I think is one of the topics that really interested me as well, is the issue of race. And do you think that race is brought up in the documentary at all? And if so, how do you think they addressed it?
I think it's interesting because I think race was brought up, but in the way that even today it's brought up without saying it, if that makes any sense. Like you could tell as the viewer, and you know, you could understand what they were saying about these the culture and these kids. I think one of the guys was even like, I forget who it was, but was one of the officials was like, if they want to do something productive, you know, pick up a broom or, you know, get a mop or something and do something. You know, it wasn't like, you know, get a desk job position at our office or anything like that. It was like, you know, we want you to clean up the floors. You know what I mean? So like, I feel that when you're looking at when you're watching this documentary, like you can't hide the fact that there's an undertone of a racial element to the situation. You know, these kids, you know, I don't know all their personal situations, but you know, some of them, it felt as if they might have just been in less fortunate situations and were expressing themselves the best way that they knew how. And I think that what often happens back then and even now is it's overlooked, you know, the conditions of which people are in and what resulted to those, or what conditions kind of put the people in the positions that they were currently in. It's just kind of looked down on as like, oh, they're not doing anything with their lives. They got nothing better to do. And all these things that they're just kind of categorizing these Black and brown individuals. And the crazy thing is, I think that they even talked about it a little bit too in the documentary. Like one of the white kids who was doing graffiti, he was like, I steal cans and stuff like that, but you know, I don't really get in trouble for it. It's usually the other kids that do. And you know, that's an element of this too. I think that, you know, race is something that definitely plays a part in this documentary. It's not said directly, but I mean, you feel it and you understand it and know it. I think when you understand what they're talking about from a culture perspective, from a societal perspective, and they talk around it a lot. I think, you know, just trying to label the kids as, you know, these hooligans who are just doing crazy things, nothing better to do with their lives, you know. And it's interesting because I saw what they were doing in the documentary with the juxtaposition of one of the kids' mothers combined with the things that they were saying, like some of the officials were saying, because they would do a cut from the officials directly to his mother, kind of saying a similar thing. And it was one of those things where I noticed what they were doing, where they were basically trying to say like, hey, the mom kind of doesn't like him doing this either. Or when the kid is like, you know, it's for me, like I do this on the subways for me. I don't do it for anybody else. And she's like, nobody knows who you are. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this isn't, and like his mother didn't understand the culture the way, just the same way that the city officials didn't understand it. And I saw them doing that juxtaposition, but I kind of felt a little funny about that, because I was like, his mom is just being a mom that is, you know, talking to her son about coming home late and doing something random in the streets. You know, she's not saying that who he is as a human being and as a person is just this hooligan, you know. So I feel that race was talked about, but in a sideways kind of way, you know. They didn't go there directly, but I think for me personally, like I could feel it, you know. I knew what they were talking about. So
Jed, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I mentioned those comments earlier about the nice white shiny car pulling into the station and, you know, holding back our enemies from destroying our trains with the barbed wire. There's this kind of like corollary to like prison and in these situations. And I think the filmmakers, you know, definitely put those in there for a particular reason. I also thought the ads that Ed Koch had kind of put up there, you know, like with Hector Camacho or whatever it may be, you know, almost like putting him as a like, well, we're not talking about the black and brown people because we put, you know, a brown person on this poster, right? And it's not for chumps, it's for champs or something. So it's just some wording here and there that is used that I think, you know, to tell you the truth, Ed Koch would not be saying some of those words if it was about, you know, if it was only white kids like doing this, right? And I think that that is extremely evident. And I mean, so there, if you read a little bit more about the film, like the filmmakers had to get help from the New York City mayor and the police department to make this film, because the filmmakers didn't want to be on camera because they knew that they would be arrested. And so there was some kind of dialogue. And so right then and there, as Napoleon would say, that's not explicitly about race, but because a large percentage of these artists are obviously black artists, you know, they knew that they would be mistreated in the system, because that is obvious in society for a lot of people, especially people of not white race. And therefore that, to a certain degree, maybe that is why it's not brought up, is because it was somewhat swept under the rug before the film, saying, hey, we've got this, we won't make this a racial thing. I'm assuming here, I'm throwing this out there, but knowing that they did get that kind of cooperation from the government, the state, the city government, that there was some kind of obvious underpinning to it all. I mean, both of the filmmakers are white, so that is to be noted. You know, not to say that they're obviously conscious of the situation. But then there was also a piece that I was watching very closely when they were interviewing people on the subway to see if they would like who they were interviewing, and that were saying, oh, it's despicable, it's this, and they had those single word quotes. And they did actually, I think, represent a broad group of people that were saying it's despicable. But maybe that's just for the film. Maybe they were very conscious of saying that this is something across different races, that we found someone from each race that decided that it's not race and gender, that says that this is despicable, is one of the words I know was used. So like Napoleon said, it was an underpinning, and those of us that's conscious about race issues as much as we can be, we can feel it.
Yeah. Does anybody have something to add?
I'd like to add something.
Sure.
You two are doing a very good job of explaining these questions and expanding on these questions. So you're doing a good job with that. I want to talk about the soundtrack a little bit. And I know we've been talking about hip hop the last couple of questions. And the soundtrack is great. The Message is a great song. But one of the things about the soundtrack, and Jed mentioned it earlier about the whitewashed trains and how it's kind of a metaphor it's a subtle metaphor about, the race relations in that area. And it's interesting. The soundtrack is mostly these rap songs from African-American rappers, but then there's a funeral march in there by Wagner, a very old classical song. And it's put into the film where the trains appear, where the whitewashed trains are. It kind of feels like a funeral, like the death of that culture. You can see a similar thing in the musical Hamilton, where like King George is coming up, and he's with all the other rap songs in the musical. King George comes with his Baroque and classical style. So it's a way of subtly mentioning how these people in the government are kind of killing the culture that these kids work so hard to create and represent.
It's like imperialism, right? I mean, that's what you're getting at to a certain degree. It's like this imperialistic kind of mentality in both Hamilton and Star Wars. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's a great point to bring up, because that's something that it's that choice of that song. It's interesting because it's like, the trains are all clean, right? So it's like whenever you think something clean, it's supposed to be like in good shape or ready or beautiful or whatever. And then that song being played, this ominous kind of song, and the juxtaposition of the visual, and like Stanley Kubrick is one of my favorite directors, and he's known for doing that. And he does that in The Clockwork Orange a lot. I'd recommend seeing that. Prepare yourself for some crazy,
I've seen it.
yeah. So yeah, there's a lot that goes on in that. So, but like, there's things that happen in that kind of like correlated with that moment where, you hear this regal song, but then it's positioned with like something that's totally not that, or it's a totally different kind of emotion. So I think that's a cool call out, or at least how you recognize that, because to that point what me and Jeb were saying, it's like, I think they were trying to deliver messages without the people who approved them to do this documentary knowing about it. I think that's what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
I think it's Cheryl.
Hey, Cheryl.
Yeah, I saw, that was one of my favorite movies as growing up. And just because of what you guys are talking about, how, you've got this, picture that is, painted, but then you have the underbelly and the craziness that goes kind of behind the scenes. The other thing that struck me, I don't know, I had to step away for a minute, but the appropriation of the art, that when the poor kids were doing it, it was vandalism. And then as it becomes more mainstream and you find it in galleries and on canvas, then it becomes art. And I hope that some of those people that were in the film, if we Google them today, hopefully they have been able to, take their art off the train and into more, what we call mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream. But it also goes back as a person of color, just, again, when things are kind of started, hip hop started, rap, the DJ culture, the art, the music, when it is appealing, and when someone from another culture, white culture, sees it, they take it and run with it and are able to capitalize on it much more so. And, you know, kudos to them if they went to the people in New York City and kind of got, I guess they got a pass for, okay, we're going to show these kids doing what you think is, they should, what did Koch say? Well, you don't need to kill them, but they should go to jail for 5 days or something. You know, if they did that ahead of time, well, great. That was great, because you don't want to put somebody, exploit somebody and make money off of somebody. It's similar to what happened to the people that were involved in the film last month, where, you know, you've got something going on, it's good, a few kids get a benefit, but the price that kids had to pay for this intrusion into their life and for this expectation of what they will share with the filmmakers, and then the filmmakers make all the money. Yeah, I'm sure everybody got paid, but, you know, if you're a poor person in New York City and you're tagging or bombing on trains and somebody wants to pay you $100,000, yeah, you think that's $1 million. Whereas these filmmakers, they get these awards that offer them a jumping off point to make much more money on art that they create or they turn around and create. Not to take anything away from the filmmakers, that's not my point. But I'm glad that we're looking at this in this way, and just I don't know, it kind of evens it out. I'm hoping that the other people on the call can get a little understanding and a little. I know the artists know where I'm coming from, but to know that the roots of art, you know, don't always come from what you see right in this moment, that there's so much history behind it that springs from it. And I guess that art is the last bastion of what, free speech in the world, kind of. You know, we're being bombarded and controlled and, you know, oppressed in terms of the way we speak and what we talk about. That art is really the last place that we can express ourselves.
Thank you, Cheryl. That was fantastic. We also have Anne raising her hand. Anne, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that struck me so much was the idea of relative worth. These artists had put so much into what they did. I mean, it was worth so much to them, and yet no one, the people in authority, never tried to recognize anything other than a blight. And what struck me most was when they talked about putting the dogs behind the fences. I never heard once anyone in authority, from Mayor Koch on, worry about the health or the safety of any of these people that were involved. But they were worried the dogs might hit the third rail. And I thought that was a very telling juxtaposition. They weren't concerned at all about the artist, what might happen to them, and yet wouldn't want the dog to hit a third rail. And I mean, I love dogs, but still, I just thought that was an extremely telling moment.
And
Yeah, like you said, oh, they'll jump over and bite them, and Kai said, "Isn't that what they're supposed to do?" You know?
Yeah. I think that also brings up the point of protecting property over human life, and that's something that's also happening currently with all these protests and you know, social unrest, where the police are choosing to protect the businesses and the properties over the people. So that's just what I had to add. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
Can I add something to that, Maria? Which is, you bring that up, and you, Napoleon, and I talked about this, and so the other day. So I thought I'd bring it back up, which is like this idea of the unrest that happened in Raleigh, right? A bunch of property was damaged. You know, we obviously know that windows can be replaced, lives can't, you know, and a lot of the statements that people have made over time. But there was this kind of battle's not the right word, but conversation happening right after that, like immediately afterwards, of what does it mean to, when something is damaged, to replace, board it up and then attempt to put art on it. And many of the conversations that I were involved in, and eventually the route that we took for our murals, was this was not a beautification project that we put up. This was as you're saying there, Cheryl, a freedom of speech project that we were embarking on. And so we got donations of the Raleigh Murals Project to a public art response, working with Black on Black Project with Michael Williams. Mike
Yes,
Williams.
I work with him. Yeah.
Yeah. So to get like these donations, and then our goal was, we reached out to, or we would have like Junction West or this building or whoever it was saying, hey, we would like a mural on our boarded up walls. And we said, great, we're gonna pick the artist, and are you cool with them putting whatever they wanted from a freedom of speech, like you're saying, and perspective? And I think all of them said yes. But if they would have come back to us and said no, we would say no thanks. That's not what we're into for this project. That said, there was a lot of other murals that happened in the city of Raleigh after that that became flowers and pretty and a beautification of this city. And I think it goes back to this exact same conversation of what is art? Is graffiti art, or is it vandalism and all of this? And to us, like you're saying, Cheryl, and what Napoleon was saying is, it's like a self-expression, right? And maybe there is this idea of, in this case, in Raleigh, we did have permission to put these murals up. Therefore, there was a little bit less of a vandalism aspect to it. But in this case, it was very similar to like the idea of freedom of speech, and that these artists were given a platform to express themselves. And I think that that's exactly what we need as a society, versus someone like Koch coming and saying, no, this is terrible, they can't express themselves. And, you know, basically shutting down most forms of self-expression at the time.
To me, it went back to that whole thing of say my name. You know, I don't have a voice. I want a voice, and I'm going to make my voice be heard. And it, you know, it's just such a creative way to do it, especially for these young people in the movie. I mean, that art it was spectacular. And I had no idea that if you go underground in New York City and you look at the walls, you would see all that work that people did. And it's just to be able to express who we are.
Yeah, and just to build on that, I feel like that's what people forget about foundationally, that's what it is. I feel like it's very easy, and we're conditioned to think when people look at certain groups of individuals, their mind immediately goes one place. And when you look at it foundationally from a self-expression place, whether it's the graffiti, dance, you know, music, and if you stay in that place, and if you really honor that place, there's so much beauty in it, and there's a whole world that you don't even know exists, because you're allowing yourself to fall into the definitions of what you're being told that it is. But like when you look at what some graffiti was, and once again, there's a lot of different styles, just like music and dance and everything. But you know, there's, you know, for instance, wild style, which is like you can barely even read it, and it's just these hard angles and these like twists and turns. And think about like the things that some of these youth were going through at the time. You know what I mean? They were going through these twists and turns and hard angles, and no one would listen to them. And so and that's what I mean, when you listen to hip hop, how it's these booms and baps and loud snares and like crazy synthesized sounds, you know what I mean? Like it's this, honestly, it's like a beautiful calamity. And I think that's what I mean, is that the culture understood it to be beautiful. And when you didn't take the time to actually look at it and participate in it and really see it for what it really is, you don't get the opportunity to understand the culture and see the beauty of it. And when you speak from the place of like, you know, just what you were saying, Cheryl, like, you know, once it was in the galleries, it's as if the white people at the time who didn't either participate in these cultures or didn't go to the areas where this art came from or just didn't know anyone associated with it, once they took it and put it in the gallery, though, it's kind of like they now own the space and they now owned the way it was perceived and positioned and formed. So then it felt more comfortable to them. And what's weird is like in their own way and in their own space, they then like saw the value in it, I guess. But the crazy thing to me was like this same thing was on the trains, you know what I mean? And like this same thing was all around you before, but people weren't supporting it like that. People weren't backing it like that. And so many times, you know, from then all the way to now, sometimes people with not so great intentions, they dangle resources in front of artists. And they say that like, you know, you can get paid this if you just let us own all the rights to it. You know what I mean? Or because from a business perspective, and I was talking a bit about this earlier, you know, as I moved through my career and just life as an artist and just a professional, you really start to understand the business side of things, and you realize how much of decisions are based on that aspect. And you know, to what Cheryl was saying earlier, it's like, hey, we'll give you $100,000 for this thing. And it's like, you're an artist, so of course you'll want this. Meanwhile, they know they can make 5 billion or something, you know what I mean? So I think it's just an internal struggle as an artist. And I, you know, something that I look forward to and work, you know, is a goal of mine and you know, people that I'm close to too. We mentioned Sean Koenig. I encourage you all to look him up in the area. He's somebody that came from this era, literally, of Style Wars, and he has now gotten to the point where he has the same reputation that he has always had as far as the culture, but he also has his own business to where he's kind of been able to cross over a little bit in ways where like he designed a whole sheets truck, like you might see it driving around on, you know, just wherever, but like he's able to kind of cross the two worlds. And I think for a lot of artists that tend to try to stay with it, you find yourselves in these pockets of like always honoring the artist in you, you know, that will never die, combined with I need to pay my mortgage. And you know, you have skills that can help you do that. But I think that over time, as you continue to go down this road, and as I hope that, you know, they grew up and were able to do the same things, you're able to start to bob and weave between these situations because you become more well-versed in how the business side of it works, and you kind of understand the games that can be played at this level. And like, you know, these kids were just trying to do the one thing that made them happy at the end of the day. You know, that's really what it was. But they were being looked at by the system as costing them money. You know what I mean? That the reason they didn't like it is because it costs them money to pay for these trains, you know? And so rather than, you know, give these kids an abandoned gym that they could do whatever they want to do in, or hold classes where they could teach and get paid, or, you know, something like that. It was like put barbed wire on the fence and stick the dogs on them, you know? So I think that, you know, there's as the eternal struggle of artists, you know what I mean? And I think that as we move into the future, it's just going to evolve in a lot of different ways. It'll still be the same foundational struggle will be there, but then you have like, you know, I post a picture on Instagram that I drew and then I find it on a t-shirt at Urban Outfitters, you know, like that's something that you gotta like navigate. So I think it just gets more complex over time, but foundationally, I think that, you know, they're dealing with the same things then, or we're dealing with the same things now that they dealt with then too.
Yeah, this is actually a great transition to another talking point is, you know, the issue of corporations and businesses that are now currently capitalizing on street art and graffiti aesthetics. And now it seems like that's something that's selling, and they're using that, you know, for profit, to make a profit. And, you know, my question here is, do you think corporations that are adopting this aesthetic, do you think it's helping bring attention to graffiti as an art form and maybe helping it be taken more seriously? Or do you think they're simply exploiting the aesthetic for their own gains? And another question I want to pose too is, do you think ultimately these corporations are helping the artists or, you know, hurting them? So open floor, if anybody wants to add to that or try to answer.
I think a lot of it comes from, I mean, for instance, I'm a big advocate for like, if I'm a big advocate for letting the artist shine, you know, like supporting from behind the scenes in the way that you know that they need to be supported, and let the artist be the one that gets all of the recognition and the shine. And if you dive deep enough, you'll see that, you know, they may have been able to be given a platform by so-and-so or corporation or whatever. But I think that once again, it really does come down, for some corporations and for some businesses, it comes down to a business decision. How will this help my business, or how will this allow my business to be perceived within the community if I help this organization or this person or these things? There are businesses out there that are doing exactly that. I think if you've been in the game long enough, you can kind of understand how to navigate some of these places. If you're an artist on the come up and you're just trying to get exposure and develop your portfolio, like you may not see that as much or recognize it as much, and you might take that opportunity to kind of get your name out there and get going. And you know, I've been there when I was young in the game, just trying to just get a body of work. You know what I mean? I get it, but I think that I think corporations and businesses, the thing that's unfortunate is they have a really great opportunity to do it the right way, a huge opportunity to do it the right way. And I hope and wish that they would all the time. But I think that there are also businesses that look at it from the angle of like, okay, this is hot right now. So if we do this, this will make us look great, and we'll be helping them out at the same time. So that's, you know, it's win-win, you know what I mean? But like, I feel that a true collaboration, in my eyes anyway, is one where the artist is fully supported, they get most of the shine, and the light is always on them. You know, like the corporations can be in the fine print, or, you know, if they want to put their logo on something, I get it. But like, I think that once again, similar to the gallery, it's like, you know, people have been expressing themselves not only in this city, but in other places forever, you know what I mean? And I think that if you want to give somebody an opportunity or kind of collaborate or do something like that, then, you know, do that, but always do that, you know what I mean? Just don't just do it when it's hot, you know what I mean? Like do it when like you see somebody in the community, or you see something and it's like, hey, let's bring this person in here because their stuff is great, versus just like wanting to make it happen because that's what you saw on the news that everybody else is doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Instagram changed the game for all of this, right? Like it truly like changed the marketing game for so many like companies, and with that came street art, murals, and all of this. As every business wants a mural because they can hire influencers to stand in front of the mural, or people from the community are going to come take their photos in front of that mural, and therefore it becomes a marketing tactic for businesses and corporations or whatever it may be that their employees are going to take. So are they supporting the artists, or are they just trying to, someone in the marketing department is a Gen X, or sorry, millennial or Gen Z, and they're like, hey, we need a mural, because that's the hot thing, as Napoleon's saying. And I think that they are just hopping on the bandwagon, the train, to use hopping on the train and putting graffiti on it and riding into the city, just to join that. That said, the difference in the businesses or corporations that are not just doing it for the marketing, they're doing it for purpose and meaning, because they will allow for a mural that has purpose and meaning, and it celebrates diversity, or it celebrates equality, or talks about the history of protest, or like I mentioned earlier, gives artists the opportunity of freedom of speech to say what they want. So there's a fine line between, in my experience, businesses and organizations that are doing it for, like Napoleon says, to give the artist a space. Trophy Brewing is a really good example of just giving their walls to artists that are just, and not only artists, but concepts, like climate change and voting and the history of jazz artists and things like that. Whereas there are other organizations, maybe big companies, are like, our lobby needs a big mural. It needs to be colorful. How does it frame in Instagram so that people take a photo, come here, they learn about our company, and eventually we make more money. Those are two completely different scenarios that Napoleon is mentioning. And I think that that's kind of, to a certain degree, where we are with art and street art right now, is it has become a marketing ploy, unfortunately.
Just to mention, or to shout out Trophy Brewing, Chris Powers, I met him in, I think, 2005. And I don't know if you all know it or not, but him and Sean, who's the owner of Buku, the restaurant, they started, in my eyes, one of the first, back then Raleigh didn't have, there was one place to go to do anything. And one of the places to go was Red Room. And they started this thing called the Green Room, where you could go and watch spoken word and comedy, and then it would turn into a little dance club after that. And they founded that and started that, and that was one of the very first things to do that was just different in Raleigh. And so, just to build on what Jed was saying, one of the reasons why I support them and just know that they're good dudes is because they've always been like that. Since day one, they've always been like that. And I think that that's kind of what we mean, where it's there's businesses that it's it's just with certain people that you meet, or just your intuition, where you're I don't, this situation or this whatever just don't feel right. You generally can understand that vibe. And even in the 80s, for instance, these kids were dancing on cardboard boxes, right? You stereotypically hear breakdancing on cardboard boxes, where there was businesses that were selling cardboard boxes with their logos on them. And that kind of speaks to what we're talking about, is they were branding the boxes so that these dancers could dance on them, so their logo could get seen by those other people, and they might start wearing their clothes or whatever. So that's what I mean. It's a very, very much a game. And I think you get more privy to the game as you get older, and you just get more well-versed. You might slip into something and you realize what it is, but I think you just, over time, you just get more well-versed and picking up on the signs of okay, I know, now I know what this was really about. You know what I mean? Just stuff like that,
Does anyone have anything else to add? I do want to say that I think it's, having corporations and businesses now, trying to seek out the graffiti street aesthetic. I think it's very interesting to note the contrast from, the 80s and the era of style wars in New York, how these artists are classified as criminals and hunted down by the police, and now they're being sought after by huge corporations and businesses, and given these opportunities. So I think a lot has changed in these years, and who's to say what things will be like 10 years from now, and what the graffiti aesthetic will look like, what the street art aesthetic. Ethan, you could go ahead.
I have a question. I don't know if this isn't really about corporations, but in the movie, there was kind of this section about how graffiti is starting to be more it's starting to be exhibited more in a professional setting, like in galleries and museums. And do you think there's a problem with people going into museums and viewing that as art, but condemning it on the streets and on trains? Is there a problem with those two dual thoughts?
That's a perfect transition, Ethan, because that was another big question that I had that I wanted to pose to everybody is, at what point does, graffiti / street art stop being street art and just become art? Like, why does, when can we get rid of that label of street art or graffiti? And, if it's exhibited in a museum, does that just make it art? If it's in a gallery, can it just be called art, or does it still need to have that street graffiti label before it?
Like the lady says, is like, she said, this thing feels like it came straight from the train. I think she said that. Those are her exact
Like
words.
it was like cut off. She's like, it looks like it was cut off, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, to that point of that, when she said that, it's like, now it's in a safe space for her to accept it. You know what I mean? It's in a place that feels familiar to her, you know what I mean, where she feels safe to look at it, and she can talk about it now in this artistic way when it was there the whole time, you know what I mean? And I think that's kind of the underlying thing that's not talked about, when we were talking about race earlier as it related to that moment. But just to kind of speak to your question, Maria, like, I think about when you have somebody like Van Gogh, right? His style, which was very abstract or whatever. And then you have somebody like Rembrandt, who was like almost realism, like his lighting and his paintings and stuff was just like so like perfect in a lot of ways, right? And at the time, like, Van Gogh was just seen as this guy doing this weird stuff that, people would just hang in random coffee shops or whatever, And like, I feel that in my eyes, it's always been art. It's always art. I feel like what happens in society is we are scared of things we don't understand. And the way that we feel better about it is by putting a label on it. And so when we can say like, oh, well, that's street art and it's this and it has no meaning and I don't value it, or that's urban, you know what I mean? Or that's this or that's that. It makes us feel like we're more in control of it. When if you strip all those things away and you just look at it and how it makes you feel and what it makes you think about, in my opinion, it's art. It's like, it's because for me, like when you think about the graffiti they were looking at, it's just something that they'd never seen before. Foundationally, that's what it was. And because it didn't have a name and they couldn't control it and they didn't know how to define it, I feel like that's what made them want to call it, oh, that's not art. The reason it wasn't art is because they didn't know what to call it. You know what I mean? Like for them, and I just feel like, because you have to think about it, it's like, okay, if you're saying that that's not art because it's on the trains and you don't get it, what if somebody that you said was art was doing that on the train? Would you call it street art or would it be art? You know what I mean? So I feel like that would force them to answer some hard questions. But for me, in my eyes, like whenever I've seen anything, and just because, I understand the difference between, and I think we were talking about this a little bit earlier too, where it's like, they were putting some real time and effort into some of these bombings, essentially, these tags, you know what I mean? So like, you see the artistry in them, right? Now you also see people like the guy Cap, who was just walking down, just spray painting stuff, not caring. Like for him, it was more about just being the guy who was just hating on everything and erasing stuff. Like that was like what he got out of it. Would I call what he was doing art? I wouldn't necessarily label it as art. I would label it as a an internal struggle that he has with himself, that he's getting out on other people's work. You know what I mean? But I'm not gonna label what he was doing as a certain thing, other than what they, from a slang perspective, in the culture, called what he was doing. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the thing, is like, what he was doing was identified as something that was not reflective as positive within the culture. You know what I'm saying? And I just feel that when it comes to if it's art or not, at the end of the day, I don't think that anyone is the one to be able to judge that. I think that, you know, one of my favorite art teachers, I always remembered, he said, art is transcendent and universal. That always stuck with me. And so whenever I think about that as it relates to what I'm looking at, the first thing I think of is like, you know, do I feel that this is transcendent and universal? You know what I mean? Can this cross all boundaries? Can it be understood or felt by a lot of people? And I don't know. For me, it's always been art. I know that's kind of a tangent, but like for me, just looking at it, it's always been art to me. It's just something different, just like different personalities, or like, think about jazz. Like there's some jazz that like John Coltrane, nobody understood what he was doing, but they knew that it was something crazy that was good, and that's all they could say about it, you know, but they didn't dismiss him, you know, they just knew it was just something from another place. And I think it's art. Just because you don't understand it, you know what I mean, doesn't mean that it's not art, you know what I mean?
I would agree with that. And I'll say that, like, it's all art. Of course it's all art, but the context does change the meaning to a certain degree, right? So, and I say that thinking about Banksy's work, and how, you know, I lived in London for 2 years and hung out in Shoreditch where Banksy was kind of coming up at the time. And, you know, I'd see a rat here or a rat there, and I didn't fully understand it. And then over time, more of his work was going up, and I say him, we don't fully know, but, you know, and so Banksy's work in the context of being in the street and in the city does, I mean, harken back to this like original graffiti of like making a mark on the city and making a statement. Granted, Banksy's is much more political, or social, maybe is a better word than political, social commentary. And so that, granted, art in a gallery can have social commentary too, of course, and it does. But there was something different in my mind seeing and walking the streets of London and seeing Banksy's work there. Fast forward 10, 15 years later, I'm in Chelsea, New York City, and I walk by a gallery and I kind of do a double take. I turn my head and go in, and sure enough, there are framed Banksys inside of a Chelsea gallery, kind of being sold, you know, or at least being kind of displayed in such a way. So back to the original question, which is like, when it transitions, what happens? I think it does change the context, and maybe it changes the definition and meaning around it, because, you know, why they say in the film, I think one of the kids was like, I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing it because I just want to make a mark on my city, you know? And so there is that aspect of, in many cases, street art of self-expression. I say street art, but, you know, as Napoleon's saying, art that happens in the city, like, you know, rather than on a canvas that then gets hung up with a little clip on a white wall, right? I think there is a big difference. And so if we flip that backwards, you mentioned Van Gogh and Rembrandt. If we saw a Van Gogh or Rembrandt in the city on a wall, our brain would be confused in a way, because we were accustomed to seeing it on a wall, right? In a gold frame, you know, with security guards around it and all of this. That wouldn't be the case if we saw a Rembrandt or a Van Gogh. Well, maybe it would, because it'd be so kind of sought after and expensive. But to me, I'm not really kind of saying anything. I just thought that anecdote is so interesting that, you know, you bring up jazz too, of like a jazz busker on the street that's just there to entertain people, right? Maybe he or she is wanting some money, but that's not why they're there, probably. You know, in many cases, they want to entertain and give people. That's much different than a jazz artist on stage, which is there to perform for people as a way to make money. And of course it is art too. The context is just so different that there's no right answer, but there's so much to kind of discuss around this. And I think that, I mean, Herring and Banksy, and we talked about Basquiat in a former conversation of like, what does it mean for these artists to then go from, Keith Haring just drawing because he loves to draw, or Basquiat making art because it's a self-expression for politics and social commentary, and Banksy as well, to then all of a sudden their work is worth a bunch of money and on t-shirts at H&M and Uniqlo, right? That's a big gap between those two, and it does change the meaning and the context of which the art was created.
I thought about Basquiat, the movie Basquiat, that came out, whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago, when they did the gallery scene in the Style Wars. It was that's all I thought about as soon as that lady was like, yeah, it pulled, she was saying it pulled from the train, and because she, maybe never even been down on the subway. It definitely reminded me of some scenes from Basquiat, the movie.
Does anyone else have anything to add to it?
You're not this past spring break, but the spring break before, my daughter and I took my 9-year-old grandson to London. And when you travel with a kid, you do things differently. So we took a bicycle tour. And one of the last stops it has historical places and statuary and all the things you'd think of, but one of the last places was going through a tunnel filled with graffiti. And we stopped and we had the opportunity to tag the wall. And my daughter and I were both, we were the adults in the group. So we were discussing, really and truly, are there any real wall artists here, or are they all just people that come through? But there were some really nice things there that we found that we thought looked professional or well done. But I can tell you for sure that when my grandson tagged that wall, it was art. He put so much of himself into it. He brought it home in a photograph. And one of the things he said was, this will be here forever, which of course we know it won't. But there was no doubt that in that moment, that kid made art. And so a lot of it is in the experience of creating, whatever it is.
Very true.
Yeah, I also say, I think it's Austin Kleon or someone that talks about that we need to pay more attention to how kids create art, because they are like the ultimate version of self-expression, because they don't think about proportions and shit like that we think that matters, right? That they think about the imagination and how things. So I totally agree with that. And you bring up a great point that I was going to bring up, which is I believe that we need more options for exactly what you're saying, which is, we have the free expression tunnel at NC State, and there's one block on South Street that has an alleyway that allows artists to put stuff up. Adam Peel, an artist here, used to allow his building to be painted very regularly, but rarely do we have an opportunity in urban settings for this kind of like ad hoc kind of way where people can kind of paint on top of something, and it is a free expression, it is a free range kind of situation. I would encourage, not to throw this back on you, Maria, but like, I think that's something the NCMA could really do a really cool job with, which is creating a wall out, in the park that is kind of commissioned regularly, or other people can kind of put things on. I know it does open up, the possibility of being vandalized, but so does having any mural in any place. And so I think it's something that I wish more people would allow or facilitate in cities, is these free expression walls that get changed, and anyone could come like tag it or add their own thing, and it'll definitely define culture, just like any of those walls that have like gum stuck on them in cities, right? It becomes kind of part of the cities, or the locks in Paris that are on the bridge and things like that the free expression tunnel is just something that is so beautiful, that has been used for marketing and Instagram. And NC State, Koenig, speaking of Koenig, he paints there all the time for NC State for marketing opportunities. And I think we need more of that, because it will say, this is where you put that, right? And not that you can't put it on random walls, but it starts to say, here's a place, you want to do it? Here, show your style here, let's do it, right? And it becomes a bigger part of urban I say urban culture, but we've talked about this, Napoleon. I don't mean it in a negative way. I mean like city culture, right? You know, like, yeah. So yeah.
When they had the rabbits at the art museum a couple years ago, they had some like 4 or 5 people doing graffiti. I remember that. That was really cool.
Yeah, we did that at Street Carnival too, and like the walls where you kind of have live painting and things like that. And Cam has done some of that too, which is really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, I think that brings up something else that if these kids in Style Wars, if they had more legal outlets of creative expression, if they had art classes in their schools, if they had, you know, after school art classes that they could attend, do you think that you know, that would have changed the way, you know, the way they had to, they were classified as criminals and hoodlums and hooligans, and you know, if it was legalized, if it was something that was open and something that was accepted. So I guess my argument then is, you know, if the city, instead of criminalizing it, had and criminalized them, would have provided these outlets of expression, that would have completely changed things for them, for the city. I think it's amazing to, well, I think it's fascinating to try to imagine that.
I don't think it would have happened in the classroom, because, you know, that, I don't know how important, you know, being in a classroom is, but if there was space where they could just have free, go at it, express yourself. And then for the ones that wanted to teach the younger ones, because there was a relationship in the movie where the older kid was teaching the younger kid and saw that he had potential. So if there is a space somewhere that can do that. And then one of the clips that we looked at, there's a gallery, I don't know, I forgot where it was, where they just have space where artists go. Now these are more, you know, fine artists, graffiti artists, okay? Because it does look like a museum, but it's just a warehouse with empty space, and they invite artists to come and just do whatever. And so a space like that would certainly be a different outlet.
Like imagine if they would have saw what these kids were doing and they were like, look, it's a problem for the trains, you know, it's not good for the trains. If they would have just took like $1 million and built this giant warehouse with a bunch of, you know, walls and whatever, no rules, you can do your thing. And then throwing, well, this is I'm going to say this and then I'm going to follow it up, kind of like negating what I just said. But like, I could see how that could have potentially helped, right? However, I could also see how within the culture, if you were to go to this place and do it, it would become like less legit, or like it's not as raw, or it's not as real, or whatever, you know what I mean? That doesn't negate.
People wouldn't see it either. I mean,
right.
That was the purpose, that these trains were going all over the city.
It's the thrill
what was
of
wrong with having it on the trains? Like, you know, let the trains, paint the trains gray when you buy them, and then just, you know, okay, let them do it. Just make it known that it's okay to do this kind of art on there. Because some of those guys were really, really creative. And I mean, you couldn't tell their name. You had to really look to see, okay, where's their name?
Something's not discussed in the film, and I think that, you know, I'm curious, like, if Koch and, you know, New York at the time, because of, we'll just say, crime in New York City was pretty bad at the time, right? And that's actually not discussed in the film. And so I'm curious as to how that is like connected to this, and how connected in their like attempt to clean up the city from a crime perspective. And this is a piece of it. I'm not advocating that they should have been doing that. I'm just saying that I think that it's just thinking back on how the film is made, that they're kind of singling out that this is the stuff that they're trying to do in New York City. They're trying to clean up the subways. Well, they're also trying to do it in a lot of other different ways that this kind of got lumped into. And so I'm curious if that, like, you're saying, if they could have found, rather than like attacking all crime in one kind of way of whitewashing it and saying you're bad, you are a criminal, of like Napoleon saying, kind of actually being designers and problem solving and saying, hey, how can we do this? We know your train is traveling all through the city. Let's give, like you're saying, Cheryl, how about 5 trains? There's 5 trains that are gray, and the other 20, you do not do it, right? Maybe they would respect that, and they would say, okay, give us these 5, because the big point, like you're saying, is that these trains travel all across the city. That's a moving gallery. You can't ask for any better marketing than that, right? You cannot ask for marketing in a Chelsea gallery where it's like stuffy than you can on a public train. And so I wish they would have problem solved in a better way, and maybe not have lumped it into the kind of crime dragnet that New York City was attempting at the time, right?
I agree. I mean, I think that's exactly what they did with these kids, is like they lumped them into the crime in the city. Like, you know, like they're just like, they weren't talking about the crime and the drugs and everything that was going on. They were coupling these kids and what they were doing with that scene. And what happens so many times, and it happens to this day, when you look at the culture from the outside, you stereotype it based off of how it's been marketed to you your entire life. You don't know, and your own definitions of what beauty is. And what you don't know is that within these cultures, there's mentorship, as you saw in Star Wars, with the guy that was bringing up the little kid. You could tell that little kid like really like looked up to him. You know what I mean? Like really appreciated what he was saying about him. You saw the guy who only had one arm, and he was talking about like, you know, people think I don't do stuff, but like, you know, I just have this arm thing, but you know, it doesn't stop me from doing what I'm doing. And there's just so many definitions, or there's culture and there's a world that within these things, and that's what people don't understand. And it's something that I've always felt, that within this world that we all live in, there's worlds within worlds within worlds. And like, just what I always say about just the breaking culture, like if you see it in commercials or in movies, you usually just see somebody spinning on their head or just doing something stereotypical breakdancing. But if you actually go to a battle and you go and you, from the moment you walk in to what you see, what you hear, the different conversations, the different circles, you see that it's a whole world with different kinds of connections and people traveling from all over the country and the world. And that's part of the beauty of it too, that people don't know, you know, like that's kind of the thing, is that like, this is ours, you know. It's like same within Star Wars. It's like, you all didn't want to be part of our world at all, so we created our own. And then once we start making some cool stuff, you kind of look behind the curtain and you're like, oh, you guys are actually making some cool stuff in there. I think we could sell that. You know what I mean? Like, so it's happened throughout time. I mean, it's just kind of how it goes. But like, I think technology, I mean, it does. I feel technology definitely does play a part in getting artists more exposure, that can give them opportunities where they might actually be able to get recognition on their own, which might then lead to financial stability of some sort, versus depending entirely on a corporation. Because I think, Jed, you talked about this a little earlier, or someone did, where you know, these Instagram influencers or people who are out there with all these millions of followers, it's no coincidence that the bottle on their desk might say Mountain Dew. You know what I mean? Like, it's no coincidence that the song playing in the background or the TikTok dance that they're doing is by this artist. You know what I mean? Because people are paying these influencers in order to promote their product. You know what I mean? I'm not saying all the influencers are doing that, but that's part of the culture of the world we live in now. And so I think that there's, number one, there's more opportunities where you might be able to become more of an entrepreneur as it relates to what you're really wanting to do. It's still a hustle and it's still a grind, but I think technology plays a part. And I just think that just everything that we were saying, I think that it just plays a part in where things are headed, you know.
Napoleon, I'll add too, you bring up mentorship, and I think, Cheryl, you said this earlier too about, the boy and the little boy. I think that I was thinking about hip hop and breakdancing and graffiti, and all of those are about mentorship in some form. I mean, the history of hip hop is all about teaching people how to make beats and, like sharing records and kind of mentoring. I mean, even if I talked about Eminem earlier, Dre and Eminem, and what Jay-Z has done with mentorship and, all of that. But also I'll just give, Napoleon and his crew props too, that, he's saying breakdancing. I mean, dancing is something you just don't learn on your own. Like it is, I mean, you could, but you're kind of like you're saying, you're at a battle and you can kind of learn with someone else. But one of the great things that the Raleigh Rockers do is that, they go out and they teach as well. And, half of like their appearances, we'll call them, at events are, half them dancing for entertainment, and the other half is a community. Hey, let me teach you how to do a few moves in breakdancing, so we as a community can come together under this art and can kind of be one. And that's why, like my son's elementary school has a yearly winter dance, and it is like the first year we went, it was a gym, it was chaotic, and all I wanted to do was take a Xanax and like zone out, because like it was just kids running around. There was no order, it was just playing music. So the next year I was like, screw it, I'm taking this over and I'm going to do it. And what did I do is first thing I said is I want to hire the rockers, because they'll bring some kind of mentorship perspective to this. And like that year, Brandon and a few of the rockers came in, and they played Nick, what's the DJ's name? I'm blanking on his name.
Oh,
Neptune.
Neptune, yeah.
No, not Neptune. Anyway, it doesn't matter, huh?
Special guest, Mickey.
No, the other Nick. Anyway, doesn't matter. Anyway, he played some tunes, and Brandon like led this whole thing with 2 or 3 other dancers, and basically had the whole room of like elementary school kids sitting down in a huge circle watching him dance. And then 15 minutes later, he's up on the stage teaching them, how to break. And you got 100 kids in this massive auditorium, elementary school, from 2nd to 5th grade, watching and learning. And there's something about that goes back to this film, that I think we asked about how these things are interconnected as art forms, that I think at the core of this is that mentorship that is so powerful, and the aspect of like that I don't see in rock and roll, whatever, right? I just don't see it. I see it in this community that I really respect. And I think that this film shows that. It shows that community, that they're all like sitting around, like trying to figure out how to do this together and learn from each other.
Well, thank you. With that, I will have to start concluding the meeting. We definitely did not last an hour, but I definitely want to thank Jed, and I want to thank Napoleon. This was a fascinating discussion. I want to thank all of you. And before we leave, I want to say that this film is really great, and it's very special to me. And I think it's one of those rare films that really is a document of a time, and really helps preserve that culture and that history. And I hope you continue to recommend this to other people, friends and colleagues. And I also certainly invite you all to come to our upcoming NCMA Film Clubs. They're going to be monthly, the 3rd Friday of every month. So be on the lookout. And thank you. And I'll be following up, sending a follow-up thank you email. And I'll put a few of these resources and films and recommended artists. And I'll also put up Jed and Napoleon's social media accounts, so you can follow them, keep up with their work.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy your
everyone.
weekend.
Bye-bye.
See ya.